Well, it's not so much behind the scenes that I really want to talk about with this movie, but it's more of where this movie fits into the overall genre of film history. That I think there's uh, no, I don't think anyone could argue against this. That this movie is in many ways steeped in what's called blaxploitation.
Yeah.
And I wanted to talk a little bit about blaxploitation and quote unquote urban horror, which is no longer seen as a very um, PC term, but it's what was called in the 90s, which I,
Mm.
I, I kind of, and it's now mainstream, and I kind of view this movie as falling in a little transitional point between what we would call blaxploitation and then urban horror and what is now just become just mainstream genre filmmaking. And I
Yeah.
find that fascinating that this movie kind of shows a little bit in that transition that transition happening over the decades.
Yeah. I definitely I definitely see that because like it felt like any late 80s early 90s horror but with like an all black cast. Like it didn't.
And I think I don't think that can be like overlooked, and I think that has to be acknowledged just because of how unheard of. Now
Yeah.
I can't say rare because rare implies something that occurs just at a rare rate. The James Bond III claims, and once again, I'm having a hard time repeating that claim because I just don't know. But I tried looking it up, and I cannot find anything to contradict it that this is the first all Black American horror film.
Mm-hmm.
And then before this, we had blaxploitation. That like
Yeah.
that we've sung the praises of exploitation and exploitation subgenres on this show already. So this is probably like our main chance to talk about blaxploitation. How familiar are you with like the blaxploitation subgenre? Actually, before we go that, for in case anyone that's listening that has no idea what I'm talking about and may be getting ready to cancel me again, um, blaxploitation is a real subgenre of exploitation films, in
Yeah.
that the interests and the tastes of Black Americans pre 1980s were so marginalized, even in the entertainment industry, that making movies that featured the Black casts and were targeted at Black audiences was literally part of the exploitation subgenre.
Yeah.
And that little segment of the exploitation subgenre was called blaxploitation. Some of the most famous movies to come out of that include things like Blackula,
Truck
um,
Turner
yes,
with Isaac
Black
Hayes.
Black Caesar. Uh,
Which Minnie Gentry from this movie is in Black Caesar.
yes, yes, I saw that looking up. That's right. That was another big connection we looked over.
Yeah.
Foxy Brown,
Mm-hmm.
Shaft,
Coffee.
which everyone knows who Shaft is,
Yeah.
um, and then which has turned into a really serious negative thing in modern years. But there is Mandingo, but that was also like part of the exploitation subgenre. I really don't want to describe everything that has turned into in recent decades. If you know, you know. If you don't know, I'm sorry. Of course, there was also Dolomite. Um, there is. I'm gonna get you, sucker, which is. Wait. I'm
Well,
sorry.
that was later. That was
That
like a
was later.
parody.
You're
Yeah,
you're
yeah,
right.
yeah.
You're right. You're right. I'm sorry. I scrolled a little too far ahead of my notes. Um, but there was like a big thing of just making movies to direct a to direct them at a black audience was not considered part of mainstream filmmaking, and so that
Yeah.
that audiences, those filmmaking, fell underneath exploitation films, which
Mhm.
was also really interesting. That blaxploitation is viewed as a branch off of race film. Are you familiar with race film, Lucas?
I am not at all.
Yeah, this is a like really obscure thing in American filmmaking history. That it's from, I don't know when people would actually judge it from happening, but from, according to Wikipedia, it's viewed as happening from the mid 19 teens to the 1950s, and it was an outside of the Hollywood system um, industry system, completely removed from mainstream Hollywood, in which it was black people making films for black audiences. And this was happening primarily in the Northeast of the United States. And what's really interesting here is these are widely considered a lost part of American arts, American film history, that there's documented around 500 or more different films that were made of this black filmmakers making movies for black audiences in the 19 teens, 1920s, 1930s, 1940s,
Cool.
1950s, and less of 100 of them still exist to this day.
Not
It's
so
all
cool.
it's all lost media, which also shows about how much value our culture put in preserving works from marginalized people within our culture. That
Yeah.
most of this work is largely forgotten and lost. In fact, one of the main things credited for even remembering amongst film nerds like myself that these movies even existed was in the 1980s. BET, Black Entertainment Television, started actually in the 1980s, and in their early programming, they got the rights because they were able to get them from stupidly cheap money or just copyright just expiring, that they were showing these early black made movies for black audiences.
Hmm.
And it's interesting looking into it. I can't find any specific genre related stuff, and even the quote unquote best known movies from that time period are completely unknown to the general audiences. I
Interesting.
mean, like, even to, like, the film nerds, these movies are completely unknown. Like, to give some titles here, The Green-Eyed Monster, Within Our Gates, The Green Pastures, Harlem on the Prairie, um, Cabin in the Sky, uh, Dirty Getty from Harlem, USA, Boy, What a Girl, Heidi Ho. I mean, like, none of these are movies that any even a casual film nerd has heard of. Scar of Shame is apparently one of the most film critic highly regarded of these movies. I've never heard of it.
Hmm.
Uh, so these movies have essentially been erased from American culture. I'm sure there's a lot of these movies that, especially when compared to the contemporaries, had really valid storytelling, filmmaking techniques to offer, but
Yeah.
that's a story from marginalized people in the United States of how their contributions get erased and ignored. Now, blaxploitation was that beginning to come back and the beginning to actually enter into uh, like mainstream film interests in the United States, because you had the black audiences going to see it because it was movies made by black people, starring black people, directed at black audiences. But then the white people we're also starting to become hip to it. That's why we have the term blaxploitation. And of course, like the most famous example of it, I already referenced it, is Blackula, which is actually a legit solid horror movie. For anyone listening that hasn't seen it, you may write it off as like something like hokey because of its title. It's only hokey in the context of it, the time period it was made in, but when you can put it next to any of its contemporaries, it's a legit solid horror movie.
Oh yeah.
Like I like Blackula. I think it's a pretty good movie.
Definitely.
So then,
I like Truck Turner. I like a lot of those movies, man. I do.
And so then, like, the exploitation style of filmmaking as a whole began to die out in the mid to late 80s as various aspects of it either A, got incorporated into the mainstream, or B, just turned into pure underground fare.
Yeah.
And blaxploitation, I personally argue, actually started becoming part of our mainstream entertainment vernacular.
Oh, without a doubt.
And the two big breakouts of blaxploitation, I personally argue, from a genre fan, perhaps there's a non-genre comparison, but as we've already talked about on this podcast, I am very highly educated when it comes to genre fare, not nearly as educated when it comes to everything else. But for blaxploitation in terms of genre breakout in the mainstream, we had Tales from the Hood and Candyman, which I argue forever changed the horror genre in terms of opening up to what types of audiences and perspectives horror could on a mass level cater to.
Yeah, no, without a doubt. Without a doubt.
And I think Death by Temptation just missed it by both a combination of it just being a little bit too soon and a little bit too low budget.
Yeah, people like to say that it's good to be first. I don't think that's true. I think
I have a big argument against that.
I think it's good to be second or third.
Yes.
Because when you're first, like you're still the outsider. And I think Death by Temptation pays the price for being first.